What I would like to talk about today in this lecture is just the history of the American political party system. The United States has a two-party system, but that was not a part of the original Constitution. That's something that has historically developed. Political parties, in fact, not at all were part of the minds of the founders. They really weren't thinking that way. They simply assumed Americans would all sort of think together. But very quickly, within the first few years of Washington's administration, division appeared in his cabinet between two men, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and the Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. And from the beliefs of these two men, there are different divisions about how the country ought to form, about whether the national government ought to have more power than the states. Remember our conversation earlier about national supremacy versus state rights. All of these things, foreign policy, all of these kinds of things, wound up splitting the cabinet so divisively that within two different presidential terms, by the time Washington serves his 2 terms and John Adams then serves his 1 term as the second president, clearly political parties have been formed. And this is known in American history as the first American party system. The two parties were the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. This political party system lasted for about 20 years. It lasted through the presidencies of Adams and then Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. But after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party has disintegrated. Its lack of support for the War of 1812 meant that it lost national support. And so in the 1820s, there's a time period in American history called the era of good feelings. Not because feelings were all that good, but simply because there was only one national political party. That is only going to last so long, however, and by the late 1820s, the second American political party system is forming. The groups now are not the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, but rather the Democratic Party, centered around the person of Andrew Jackson, and those in opposition to Andrew Jackson, they called themselves the Whigs, and that's Whigs, W-H-I-G-S. The reason they took that name is because they looked at Andrew Jackson as a tyrant, as a king, and in the English political system, the party in opposition to the king is called the Whig Party. This also gives you a bit of a hint of how still English we thought of ourselves. We actually, even in the 1830s, took our political party names from England. Well, this is the second American party system. Jackson leading the Democrats, a variety of people from American history, specifically Daniel Webster and Henry Clay leading the Whigs. And this political party system lasts about 20 years. And what causes the transformation here is the issue of slavery. By the time we get to the 1850s, slavery is an incredibly divisive issue in America, of course, leading to the Civil War, but it was specifically divisive within the Whig political party. The Democratic Party had less of a problem with slavery. They were simply the party of the South. Much of their political power was centered in the South, so they were pro-slavery and pro-expanding slavery into the territories. The Whigs, however, had a lot of Southerners in their group, but also a lot of Northerners, and they split into what were called the Cotton Whigs, that is to say, Whigs who supported the expansion of slavery, and the Conscience Whigs, Whigs who were opposed to the expansion of slavery. And the Whig Party was able to manage this tension only for about a few years, and by the 1850s, they simply implode, and our third political party system takes over. The Democrats stay in play. They are the same political party as they were before, no longer led by Jackson, but continuing in his ideas. But the new political party to counter them is called the Republican Party. And by 1856 or so, we actually have the Democratic and Republican parties that we have today, at least in name only. The Republican Party, originally a political party formed in opposition to the spread of slavery in the territories. Now, make no mistake, the Republican Party is not abolitionist. They do not want to eradicate slavery wherever it exists in the South. But what they do want to do is stop the spread of slavery in the territories. That is something they could all agree. And they are led eventually within just a few years by Abraham Lincoln. Well, this party system of Republicans and Democrats has continued, and it's what we have today. But the ideologies of these parties have not always followed a linear trajectory. For example, if you go back to the originality or the origination of the Third American Party system, the Democratic Party is actually the more conservative. It is the Republicans who are coming in the 1850s as the radicals, the ones who want social change. By the time you get to the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, both political parties are actually very conservative. In the early 1900s, both political parties are rather liberal. It's only in the 1920s and 30s that the Republican Party tends to be and remain conservative, and the Democratic Party tends to become more liberal. So the tracks have intertwined a little bit since the 1850s. Well, while those are the three American party systems that we've had, there have been other parties. There have been third parties. Now, there are different kinds of third parties. There's a few that I want to talk about. One kind of third party are ideological third parties. And these are parties that we have around even today, parties such as the Communist Party or the Socialist Party. These are political parties that function around a given ideology. They usually in national elections have some success, depending upon the trends in American history. The Socialist Party candidate Eugene Debs got over 1 million votes for president back in 1920. But in general, they are limited in their achievements. Another kind of party would be the one-issue party. These are parties that center around a particular issue. So unlike an ideological party, like say the Communist or Socialist or the Libertarian Party, for example, a one-issue party might be the Women's Party. In the early 1900s, pushing for the women's rights movement. The Free Soil Party or Liberty Party. Before the Civil War, these were two third parties that were around trying to obviously free the slaves. The Prohibition Party is another one-issue party, again, centered around the issue of prohibition. The very first third party we have in American history is actually in the 1830s, the Anti-Masonic Party. They were formed as a political party in opposition to a social group called the Masons. These parties tend to be very localized and again have very limited success simply because they're focused on one issue. So either their one issue is achieved, like the Women's Party or even the Prohibition Party, and then they have nothing to do. Or once it's clear that their one issue is not going to happen, they simply disappear into history. A third kind of third party would be the economic protest party. These are, in a sense, a split off of the one-issue parties, but specifically focused on economics. And probably the most famous of these and the most successful, one of the most successful third parties is the Populist Party. Populist Party was very dominant in American history in the 1880s and 90s, centered mainly in the American Midwest about farmers. This was a time in American history when farmers were suffering very much at the hands of Eastern bankers and railroads, and the Populist Party was a party that grew up to meet the needs of those farmers and achieved incredible success, so much success that actually in the 1896 election, the Democratic Party actually co-opted the Populist Party candidate, William Jennings Bryan, and sort of absorbed the Populist Party into themselves. The last ones that we talk about in terms of a third party are factional parties. These are parties that are within one of the two major parties, say the Democrats or Republicans, but are kind of faction or break off from them. And these parties are usually viewed in a very interesting way because they're seen as being divisive. They're seen as actually undermining the success of the party from which they split. Some examples might be the Progressive Party in the early 1900s or in the 1952 election. The Dixiecrat Party, that was another party in the 1952 election that pulled from the Democrats. More modern examples would be the American Independent Party or the Reform Party, or even in the election of 2000, the Green Party. If you remember, some of the conversation about that election between Gore and Bush was that Nader's party took votes from Gore in Florida, and that if he hadn't been running, Gore would have easily won Florida and therefore won the election. So these parties tend to be viewed with a lot of frustration by the political parties from which they are splitting, because their attitude is, you're not going to win anyway, and all you're doing is helping our opponents to win. Well, the United States has a two-party system. That's something rather distinctive. Most other European nations don't. They have multi-party systems. But the two-party system, though not something originally intended in the Constitution, is something that occurred rather quickly and is here to stay.